Welcome to the Advanced Auditor Training Module 6. In this module, Audit Planning, we'll be discussing ISA 3000 requirements, just briefly, and auditing against the ITA TIN code, the audit processes, and the key information that must be provided by the smelter for the audit to take place, and the ISA 3000 risk materiality and sampling plan and processes, and also forming an audit plan and preparation for the on-site audit. As mentioned, the basic training, the work performed by the auditor and the audit firm will be using the ISA 3000 Assurance Engagement Standard. That is used for auditing of non-financial data. And the non-financial data element is, of course, the smelter Step 5 report, the claims made of meeting the TIN code and the standards within the TIN code. It is fundamentally different than certification audits, and this training does not include prescriptive elements on the ISA 3000 standard because we assume that auditors are already versed with the standard and using it for conducting work in the industry. We require auditors to have industry code experience, smelter and mining experience, also experience of due diligence systems, and that the audit firm apply ISQM1, which is quality control for the work carried out. And they also meet the ethical requirements of ISESBA. Now, significant weight is placed on conducting a risk and material assessment with ISA 3000, which means that the auditors need to plan the work exceptionally well. What are the most important elements that they want to focus on in relation to the claims made in the company Step 5 report? And of course, it's not a sampling approach for the TIN code, it's all the elements in the TIN code. But with particular reference to the Step 5 company smelter report, what are the important elements that are made? And how extensively are they going to sample information related to those important elements? We're expecting that auditors and audit firms are familiar with the ISA 3000 engagement process, and looking at this slide here and the main 8 stages, we're expecting that smelters will make contact with prospective audit firms and verify that they have the credentials to carry out the work. The next point is that the auditors and the smelters will discuss the assurance engagement to fully understand the scope and the requirements, and then after that agree on a contract to carry out the work and agree what information will be provided. You'll see in the training that there's a mandatory list of information that must be provided for the audit firm to check the scope and verify the complexity of the audit and appropriately plan the risk and materiality assessment prior to coming on site. Then, of course, similar to 19011, that the audit firm will carry out an audit plan, and within that audit plan also list the information that's required, be available on the days where the audits or assurance engagement is taking place, and also what resources will be available. And that plan will obviously be submitted to the smelter and communicated to the smelter so they can prepare and make sure everything is in place prior to the auditor's arrival, and it starts off planned, arranged, and smoothly. And as the audit or the verification work progresses, we use the term audit, verification, assurance interchangeably. The auditor will record initial findings on an issue log that will be either raised at that time as the work is being carried out and the potential issue is identified, but at the very least, those findings, similar to 19011, will be presented at the closing meeting. And if there are any differences of opinion between the auditor and the smelter, that needs to be recorded at the closing meeting. And it's reasonable to expect that the auditor or audit firm provides the assurance report to the smelter within a month of the closing meeting. It's promptly wrapped up. What cannot occur is an extended audit after the closing meeting at the site that goes on to be a desk-based audit thereafter without closure. It needs to be planned and conducted well and executed very well in order to bring it to a close. And that means following these processes in this diagram, which the auditor should be familiar with based on carrying out assurance engagement. If those processes have been followed in the previous slides, the auditor and the audit firm should have prepared, as should have the smelter, and they're fully aware of what is involved as denoted in the audit plan. So the auditor and audit firm should know what they're going into in terms of complexity. They must have a firm grasp of the potential complexity of the audit and verification work to be carried out and understand the supply base, which means essentially what is purchased from where, from whom, and if the mineral is associated with Karas or not. So it should be absolutely clear about the period of assessment, minerals, materials from where, from whom, the number of suppliers, likely transit and transport routes, whether suppliers are significant or numerous in number, and all of that relates to complexity and therefore how much time is allocated to carry out the work on site. So a finite amount of time will be allocated that can only be allocated if the complexity and the work has been properly planned in advance. So when I mean complexity, if the complexity is understood and the work has been properly planned to be carried out on site and closed, not extending to prolonged off-site document-based audit. It's the smelter's responsibility to select the right auditors to carry out the verification work and the assurance engagement, and they must provide sufficient information and access to resources as personnel and documents to enable the auditors to do their job in the allocated time. If not, it won't provide value for money, and it cannot end up being a document-based audit following on from the site visit. It needs to be brought to a close in the time that's been allocated and planned. And that can occur if those stages, as mentioned before, are properly conducted. Importantly, it means if the smelter is sourcing from Karas, the auditor will need to verify what the smelter has done to ensure that suppliers do not contravene the smelter's company policy and the standards that the smelter has set up in relation to OECD due diligence guidance, tin code, and sourcing that they require. As mentioned, the smelter will need to provide the auditors with documentation from immediate suppliers so they can check the validation of the immediate supplier's performance, which will in turn enable the auditors to agree or disagree with the smelter's opinion of the supplier's performance and not just take it on face value. The planning of the audit by both the smelter and the auditor must be based on the due diligence scope of the company. For example, recycling smelter does not need to comply with all of the steps of OECD due diligence guidance and the tin code with regards to links to Karas or not. But it's a requirement of step 4 in the OECD guidance that the smelter facilitates the audit carried out by the auditor and provides them with the information to enable them to carry out their work and provides access to immediate suppliers. And there has to be a degree of cooperation and liaison between the auditors and the audit firm, as mentioned before, to ensure that the work is properly planned and executed. Planning is essential, and the smelter is required to provide mandatory information prior to the auditor going on site to enable them to put together an audit plan and communicate that audit plan to the smelter. This is a list of the mandatory information that you, as an auditor, should receive prior to going on site and to enable you to prepare an audit plan and communicate what you're going to do in the time that you've allocated to carry out the work. Once again, to be clear, the audit firm must be confident of the audit risk prior to starting the site assessment, and of course, that relates to the time that's going to be allocated to conduct the work, and therefore it should be determined prior to agreeing the assurance or audit contract. Because, quite simply, if it's a secondary smelter that's purchasing and receiving sort of waste end-of-life material only, low volumes, low complexity, the auditor and audit firm might find it suitable to only allocate 1 day for the on-site verification work, provided key mandatory information has been sent beforehand, it's been properly scoped out, and they are fully assured that this is a low complexity audit. If not, the auditors might find themselves in a situation where it transpires that it's not just secondary, it's also primary materials that are potentially linked with conflict affected high risk areas. Immediate suppliers need to be looked at and interviewed or verified, and also the use of joint initiatives and institutionalized mechanisms, the audit reports that are generated from those need to be taken into account from the company smelter side when sourcing, and also the potentially on the ground assessment team. So the complexity can extend, and if only 1 or 2 days has been allocated, then quite simply, there may not be enough time to carry out the work on site. Strong indication of how complex the sourcing practices are and the potential work to be conducted, and therefore the audit risk, the risk of the auditor and the audit firm making errors essentially and misjudgments. A good indication of that will obviously be the company's due diligence report. That's on the assumption that the due diligence report has been finalized and covers what's required of OECD Step 5 and doesn't have any exclusions with regards to mineral sourcing. An important element of the audit planning stage is the risk materiality and sampling plan, or the exercise conducted. And that's a fundamental requirement of ISA 3000, and that's obviously carried out by the auditor, but that should also be shared with the smelter. It's not the smelter audit plan, it's different. It's what is going to be looked at based on the auditor's opinion and judgment, and what level of sampling is likely to occur in relation to those parts or elements that the auditor will look at, what they think are the most risky and material in relation to the claims made by the smelter in their Step 5 report, and of course also with the tin code, which is essentially less of a sampling based approach, it's more of a compliance based approach. It also enables the smelter to be aware of the expectations of the auditor and perhaps point them in the right direction, which shouldn't be the case if they've got industry experience. For example, if the audit is taking place at a secondary smelter, the auditor should not be asking for mineral origin certificates. It also will provide a bit of an insight on what the types of documents the auditor will be looking to sample and check in relation to mineral sourcing practices, and whether those documents and evidence actually exist. Different countries call different pieces of evidence different names. Now, the risk materiality and sampling plan, as mentioned, should be communicated, but it's in general terms, and it is a guide for the auditor. Well, it's their work planning the audit to be conducted and the sampling based on what they consider to be the most material and high risk elements within the audit. After you've conducted the risk and materiality assessment and planned what information will be tested and verified, and the extent of the information to be sampled based on the risk, then you are going to have a good picture what to also include within the audit plan. And again, it's communicating the audit plan to prevent any surprises when on site. So clearly the audit plan needs to confirm the scope, minerals, materials, whether primary, secondary, the facilities, CARA or non-CARA mineral supply. Also, obviously, fundamental basic requirements, times, dates, persons to work with, to carry out interviews of the lot receipts, purchasing, supplier engagement, management systems, and also, of course, other than interviewing persons, that information needs to be corroborated on physical receipts, physical evidence of lot receipts, bills of lading, certificates of origin, supplier information, and documentary evidence. So those general document requirements will be placed in the audit plan, and they'll also be included in the risk and materiality sampling plan. The main point is that there's multiple steps within the process that we laid out in slide 4, where the complexity and the scope of the audit should be defined and understood by the auditor and reconfirmed by the smelter. And the finality of that is the submission of the audit plan, and it is to enable the audit to progress and be executed smoothly without surprises. You as auditors should be familiar with the layout of the ITA checklist, because essentially when you're carrying out the work on site, you should be interacting with the company, with persons involved in the audit and information, and not have your head down trying to understand the checklist. So the point of this slide is to remind you to be familiar with the layout of the checklist and evidence required prior to visiting site, and not sit there and familiarize yourself with the checklist, trying to understand it while the audit is taking place. Based on the auditor's understanding of the scope of the audit, the complexity, the potential risks, and allocating sufficient time, the auditor will need to execute the audit smoothly. It will be difficult in the first year of auditing. The second year will probably run a lot smoother, and it will certainly run smoother if the auditor is familiar with the ITA checklist. To repeat again, the smelter should send the mandatory evidence as stated in the earlier slide, slide 7, prior to the on-site audit. It is mandatory, and it does enable some preparation prior to going on site, and it also enables the auditor to get some information down on the ITA checklist for verification on site. For example, recording the CARA red flag procedure or processes, planning that to interview staff to corroborate the process and record that. Once again, the auditors must be familiar with the checklist and not sit there trying to navigate the checklist during the audit. And my personal recommendation is that if you've gathered the mandatory information beforehand and you've carried out a preliminary assessment, you can part fill some of the ITA checklist to verify that information once on site. Hopefully this module has reiterated what you already know about carrying out assurance engagements to the ISA 3000 standard, that it follows a set process, and in particular that you can only form that contract when you are fully aware of the risk and the complexity of the audit, and that will be based on having an insight and information from the smelter provided to you to enable you as an auditor or an audit firm to allocate the correct amount of time or an appropriate amount of time and form a risk, materiality and sampling plan based on what you understand to be the complexity and the audit risks, on the understanding that the smelter has provided that mandatory information. And then from that, you can put together a strong, robust audit plan, communicate that, as well as the risk and the materiality sampling plan to the smelter, all of which should enable the site assessment to progress smoothly and enable the work to focus on the tin code and the smelter's due diligence report and the claims and the statements within that, whether that can be evidenced.